Good evening, and welcome to the Bangalore International Centre for this program in collaboration with the International Music and Arts Society and the Deccan Heritage Foundation. This evening, we are honoured to have with us the distinguished architectural historian, Dr. George Michell, whose lecture is titled Exploring the Temples of the Deccan, 7th to 13th Centuries. As many of you know, of all the regions of India, the Deccan has the most diverse architectural traditions, and this variety is best seen in the stone temples built by a succession of dynasties which ruled over some 700 years. And who better to enlighten us on the subject than Dr. George Michell, who has made the study of Deccani art and architecture his life's work. Do please join me in welcoming on stage Dr. George Michell.
Thank you, Pratiti, for that. We just will move on. We won't look back because it's too exhausting. I have to thank the BIC and IMAS and also our foundation for making this evening possible. I was concerned that this is a book that came out a couple of years ago, so it's not a new book, but I always had the feeling that perhaps people here in Bangalore didn't know much about it because I'd never given a sort of promotion or talk about it. And what's very nice for me is that I always feel I have an audience here in Bangalore, and all of you, of course, have been to various temples, especially in Karnataka. You don't need me to tell you about Badami or Hampi. But I thought that maybe there are some temples in this part of the world, in the Deccan region, especially in Karnataka, that maybe you have perhaps heard about but hadn't gotten to and hadn't seen the pictures of. And so I thought I'll pick out those temples which are, need a little bit more exploring, and for me, were also temples that I didn't know too well. So in this book, we have gorgeous photographs by Surendra Kumar of the favorites, the great favorites of temples in this part of India, but also some that should be the favorites but are not yet the favorites. So let me get the technology organized here. So this is the title, so you know that, and you know about me, and Surendra Kumar's pictures, Suri's pictures you're about to enjoy. Now let's start somewhere that most of you probably have been to, which is Patadakal. As you know, a royal sort of commemorative place for the early Chalukya kings, late 7th, early 8th century. And as you probably know, even if you're not trained as an architectural historian, it's the one place in all of India where you get temples built in different styles next to each other. So this is the Sangameshwar temple, which is built in a typical Dravidian, South Indian style with this sort of pyramidal sort of roof and this dome-type top. And here is the Galaganatha temple. We don't know much about that. And you don't have to have a PhD in art history to see that this is different to that. And this is the great mystery. How is it that two temples probably built round about the same time, not separated very much in time, but separated very much in terms of style? This is this North Indian style with the curved tower and the ribbed amlaka, we call it, this finial. What were the circumstances that led to these two styles of temples being built at the same time? And if you think I have the answer for you, well, I don't. We have, there must be a historical explanation that these two guilds of craftsmen, people who are used to building temples in these styles, came together at this site. And one of the clues, which I've recently been thinking about, is from here. Now, this is Alampur. Now, this Patadakal is familiar to you, but probably not many of you have been to Alampur. It's in Telangana, just at the border of Andhra and Telangana. It's on the Tungabhadra River, just before it meets with the Krishna. It's a sort of holy sangam, a holy meeting of two rivers. And here is a set of temples which have come to be known as the Nava Brahma temples, even though for some reason they're all dedicated to Shiva. I don't quite know how that happened. But what's interesting is that one of them has a date, and it's built by a prince, and his mother was married to the king, And she was from central India. She was a Kalachuri princess from maybe the area around in Malwa, those sort of central Indian areas. And it's possible that she and her sister, who came down into the Chalukya territories and eventually became queens and built the great temples of Patadakal, maybe they arrived with their own craftsmen, with their own builders of temples, so they could have temples built in their style to their cults and therefore make a claim that their kingdom was somehow connected with the Chalukyas. And these marriage alliances were very important because they were ways of securing peace and trade without making war. So if you could have a good, I would say, fruitful alliance, it was worth your while. And maybe this is an architectural expression of what happened, that they brought with them these people who worked in these central Indian northern styles, and at Alampur built this series of temples, which all of them have this same sort of tower that I was just describing to you. There it is. You see these curved towers with the ribbed fruits. And beautifully preserved. So this is an example of the tower of what's called the Svarga Brahma temple. You can see the articulation of the different elements is very, very crisp. And notice these little ribbed motifs on the outside, every so often, like different stories, and at the top you have this fruit-like finial, and in the middle, all these complicated designs made from little arched motifs. So this is the North Indian Nagara style, top quality. This is not just a version, this is a top version, and probably late 7th century. And if you go to Malwa, to central India, you won't find any temples like this. There's nothing left. We can only damage bits and pieces. So here in the Deccan, in what is now Telangana, we have better preserved temples in the northern style than we do in central India. So it's one of those strange things that's happened. Anyhow, this is the Svarga Brahma temple. It's very interesting from a sculpture point of view because in the niches we have the Dikpalas, the 8 regents of the directions of space. And I can never remember them all, but I know that Indra, with the elephant, he guards the east. And so he is positioned on the east wall of the temple. So somebody worked out where to put all these guardians. So this is one of the images on the Svarga Brahma temple. And we have also less, I would say, let's say more secular themes. Here we have a lady reluctantly accepting the overtures from a gentleman on the left, but she seems to have succumbed on the right to his advances. And there's some of the lovely sculptures on the temple. And we have also these sort of images of gods, Vishnu kicking the 3, Trivikrama, the 3 cosmic steps. So great sculptures at Alampur, and if you haven't been there, it's about 200 kilometers south of Hyderabad, a bit further from Bangalore, but on the main, more or less on the main highway between the 2 cities. And the interior has these typical northern Indian style things. Notice the pots, overflowing pots with foliage at the bottom and the top of each of the columns. So let's move on to another group of rulers. So that was the sort of Chalukya, the early Chalukya, lesser known temples, and Alampur is well worth a visit. Now there's another group of rulers who came later called the Nolambas, and they had connections with Tamil Nadu, and they ruled in the southern part of Karnataka, especially in the 9th and 10th centuries. Now, this is a place called Arala Guppe. It's near Tumkur, and this is the temple. It's called the Kaleshvara, and you wouldn't want to make a trip just to see this temple. It's not very well preserved. It's whitewashed. It's nothing special. That is, until you get inside. And this is the ceiling inside the temple, and it's one of the greatest masterpieces we have of carved ceiling designs anywhere in India at any time. So, late 9th century, the ceiling panel with Shiva dancing, you can see in the middle. And again, we have these Dikpalas, the 8 regents of the directions of space, arranged in sort of clockwise direction around it. And you can see Indra at the top, riding on the elephant. And I think that's Varuna, maybe of the west. And look at these figures, flying figures with garlands, how exquisitely carved they are, and the skill in the 3-dimensional modeling of the animals and the figures. So it's splendid. So well worth the trip. Nandi. Now, probably most of you have been to Nandi, just beyond the airport. Beneath the hills, there is this site, and this also is of this period, late 9th century, and there are these pair of temples that look very much the same. One's called Bhoga Nandishvara, and the other is called Aruna Chaleshvara, but I can't remember now which one is which on the screen, but you can read about it in the book. Late 9th century, and they're quite austere. Everything's very crisp, but there's no sort of sculptural embellishments at first until you look at the windows. So this is interesting. In earlier temple architecture, carvings of gods and goddesses are placed in wall niches. In the Nandi temples, they're placed in the windows. So where the light enters the temple, you also have images of gods. Here is, of course, dancing Shiva, with holes, perforations in the slab. Light is entering the sanctuary inside. And what about this window with this curving stalk, creating circles in which we have musicians and dancers? They're absolutely beautifully carved, and it's interesting how they wish to have this type of imagery where light was entering the temple. This seems to be a Nolamba specialty, at least at Nandi. Now, all of you will have been, of course, to Shravanabelgola. You know about this great monolith, dated 981, so just over 1,000 years ago. And this was also built during this period of the Nolambas by one of the military generals. So we don't need to persuade you that this is something worth seeing, because many of you will have been there or know that you should go there. But if you go there, or had you been there, maybe you won't have noticed this. As you go into the compound where the great Bahubali image is, there's a gateway, and on top of the gateway there is this wonderful lintel. So you pass beneath it, and of course it's Lakshmi, who is auspicious and to do with fortunes. She's being bathed by elephants, and in their trunks you can see upturned pots. Anyhow, you can see the pots going like this, but look at the open mouths of the monsters, of the makaras we call them, these aquatic monsters beneath and at the top. These are quite fantastical, and it's something which the Nolamba artists seem to enjoy. And also, as you go into the compound, you may not notice this column. It's called a Brahmadeva pillar. It's probably mid-10th century, and it's carved with this vine that goes around the pillar, framing these great sort of floral, leafy motifs. It's something very unusual in Deccan art, and I haven't yet been able to study or found somebody to work out where does this design come from, because we don't find it easily, and it's so beautifully carved in the most exquisite three-dimensional cutout type of intricate work. And there's an inscription mentioning one of the patrons there beneath. And if you go to Shravanabelgola, you may not go across the town to the other hill, which is Chandragiri. But there are also interesting things to see from this late 10th century. This is the complex in a distant sort of panoramic photograph. This temple is Parshvanatha Basti. I get them mixed up. Again, this rather austere South Indian style. But there are sculptures, this magnificent, larger than human size Parshvanatha in one of the Bastis there at Chandragiri. And there are also these, if I remember, these windows, which are also beautiful. And they have legends, stories about how Jainism came to the Deccan, as illustrated in tiny little scenes. So these are all sort of details worth seeking out should you make a trip to these places. And great Heusler sculptures too. This is on the edge of Shravanabelgola town, one of the great masterpieces from the 12th century, a great seated Jina with attendants holding fly whisks and things. So exquisitely carved in completely perfect condition. So great things to see at Shravanabelgola if you make an effort to go beyond just the main monolith. Now we're jumping to a place that probably few of you have been to, called Sudi. Sudi is on the road to Badami. If you drive up to Badami from here, you might pass through a town called Ron, and then you arrive in Badami. On the way, you will pass through Sudi. So next time you do that, it's worth stopping, and the school children may welcome you, like they did the photographer on this visit. And these are now temples associated with the later Chalukyas. It's very confusing to us. these later kings, they called themselves Chalukya, but they weren't related to the early Chalukyas. We call them later Chalukyas. They just called themselves Chalukyas and sort of pretended that they were descendants of those great earlier rulers. But I believe there was no family connection at all. They just occupied the same area and they wanted to take on the same power and prestige of these earlier rulers. So this is called the Jodu Kalasha temple. It's a pair of shrines, you can see that, dedicated to Shiva, with a sort of mandapa, an open sort of pillared hall with a veranda in front. And again, this is now a development of what we've seen at the Nolambas. The South Indian style is getting more ornate, more intricate, more precise. And also, with a bit of luck, also the carvings are getting more beautiful and more precise. So this is one of the images still in worship from the early 11th century at Sudi, worth seeing, Shiva and Parvati, of course, cut out, a beautiful cut-out image. And a few steps away, we have this. Now, this is one of the most remarkable monuments in the Deccan. It's a step well. So you go along here, down the steps to the water, and you are surrounded by what seem to be temple walls. So it's like a temple turned inside out. Instead of the external walls, here are the internal walls of a stepwell. And the Deccan Heritage Foundation, which I'm part of, we are now going to restore and fix this wonderful monument into perfect condition. It's not totally collapsing, but it's become dilapidated and it needs some rescuing. Also, it's unique. We don't have any stepwell in the Deccan that is treated in this way. So the walls are exactly like a temple, but here in a place where you get water next to the temple. Now we go to a place called Baligave. It's near Shimoga, and it doesn't look very promising from the outside. It's called the Tripurantakeshvara temple, and it's got a date. We always like dates. We don't have a lot of them. This is 1070, the end of the 11th century. It has this sort of mandapa. You have to walk through this hall, which isn't very exciting at first. But if you look at the reliefs on the basement of this thing, it gets a lot more exciting. You can see the sexual scenes interspersed with scenes from the Jatakas, which is quite interesting, from folk stories. And many of you will know this much better than me, the story of the crocodile and the monkey outwits the crocodile. So instead of ending up as a lunch for the crocodile, ends up by taking refuge in the tree. So these things are illustrated and other stories, and it's quite unusual to have this. When you go into the temple, you have lovely columns with carvings on them. It's in very nice condition. And at the end of this hall, which leads to the sanctuary, you have this marvelous window. So it's another one of these perforated screens, these jalis that we have in the Deccan, which are so very special. And you may remember the window I showed you at Nandi. Again, it's similar with these scrolling vines, creating circles in which you have dancing figures, all carved, perforated, with amazing accuracy, allowing light to enter the mandapa inside. Now we're going to a place called Kuruvati. Kuruvati is on the Tungabhadra upriver from Hampi. And this is a temple dated to the late 11th century. And you can see when our photographer went there, they were still fixing it up. It needs to be propped up, the temple, because the walls are unstable, and the stone tower has been whitewashed. So we can't really observe the detail of the carving on the upper part of the temple, but we can on the lower part. Just look at the precision of this carving, this type of granite that is so finely grained that you can have this precision. So these niches where sculptures were placed, now long gone, they were loose and they've been removed somehow. But look above, you have this temple tower, this little sort of representation of a temple. And either side are these makaras, these aquatic creatures with crocodile sort of mouths and these fanciful tails. These are very popular in Deccan art, as you may know from the Hoysala monuments. But this is earlier. This is pre-Hoysala. And the story of the temple, which I'll tell you in a minute, is quite interesting. The doorway to the temple is absolutely beautiful, completely covered with carved reliefs of miniature figures. And there are these bracket figures. So you don't have to go just to Belu and Halebid. You can go to Kuravati and see these exquisitely carved ladies under trees, very slightly damaged, but they are swaying. You see with their motion under these trees, completely carved in the round. It's almost like ivory, but here carved out of stone. And when you go into the temple and you give your offering to this priest who is awaiting for you, you will look up and you will see this lintel. There's this great sort of horizontal slab which is supported on two columns. And actually this lintel doesn't really to support anything. I think the beam above doesn't need the support. It's a freestanding portal which is inserted as a sort of spatial barrier between you as the worshipper and the priest who is worshipping on your behalf. But the way it is treated, again with these aquatic monsters, these makaras at either end with these fantastic tails, these swirling tails, and then miniature images of Shiva between Brahma and Vishnu. But isn't it interesting? The images of the gods are secondary to the images of the aquatic monsters. They are really the topic for the carvers. So it's a fantastic piece of ornamental carving from the late 11th century. And in the temple there is an inscription which tells us that Someshvara I, one of the Chalukya kings, he committed suicide by ritual drowning in the year 1068. And his son, Someshvara II, built the temple in his memory. So it's a commemorative royal monument. And it's placed beside the river at the spot where the king apparently drowned. That's what we learn from the inscription. And lying loose in the temple is this carving. Here we have a seated male figure, 2 arms. He's seated in a sort of royal position, you see, with one leg hanging down, and he has 4 ladies holding sort of lotuses, and there are lots of royal parasols above. This is not a god. We believe that it is a portrait of the king who suicided. And if we are right, it's one of the rare royal portraits that we have in South Indian art, not only in the Deccan. We don't have many such portraits, but the history would suggest that this is who is being depicted here. So an important monument. So we go on now to Lakundi, which is a much better known site. Many of you may have visited it. It used to be on the main road if you ran from Hospet, Hampi area, down towards Goa. I think the main highway avoids it now. Anyhow, it has a whole set of temples from the 11th and 12th century associated with the later Chalukya kings. This is the Kashi Vishveshwara temple. It's not in complete form, but the detail is amazing. 2 sanctuaries linked with an open mandapa in between. And this is the sort of detail that you see on the temple. I mean, it's sort of dazzling to the eye to try to understand what you're looking at. But every register of the wall and the tower is carved in immense detail with a tremendous precision. And this is something which the late Chalukyas, and then followed by the Hoysalas, perfected. It's a sort of Karnataka, Deccan specialty, this sort of, this precision. Look at this. These sort of details are absolutely beautiful. So it's when you visit these monuments, you don't quite know what to look at because there's so much that attests to your eyes. And we are currently, the Deccan Heritage Foundation, working on a guidebook to these temples because we feel they're underappreciated and easily visitable. It's not like they're difficult to reach. So maybe in a year's time, you can go with the guidebook and visit all these temples. And you should go to a place called Dambal, which is also not far from Lakundi. And this is the Doda Basappa temple, probably the middle of the 12th century. And it's amazingly geometric. You can see that the shrine and the tower are laid out on a star-shaped plan. It's a 24-pointed plan. And you will say, well, how do you make 24 points? If you have a square, you have 4 points. If you take a square and you rotate it with the original square, then you have 8 points. If you keep on rotating squares, a square within a square, moving the squares around, you get these multiple points. So this is laid out on a strict geometric 6 times 4, 6 rotated squares giving you 24 points. And in the book, we have a plan, but I don't have it in the drawing here. And this type of geometric precision is carried out throughout the temple. Look at this as the tower. It's just amazingly faceted. And as the light changes across the, from one plane to another, you get this play of light and shade, and it gives you in relief this geometric design. So again, this is one of these specialties of late Chalukya architecture, these geometric complexities which we have. And it's in the walls too. This is the walls of that Dambal temple. So, and you can see that everything is at a slight angle to each other, not 90 degrees, but slightly different degrees so that you get the different points of the geometric diagram. So, huge amount of control in the design. We can only imagine, did the builders have drawings? Did they have a model? How did they work on it? How did they realize such designs to such perfection? This is something we don't have any data about. And you all know about these shastras, these theoretical, prescriptions on how to build a temple. But I don't believe any of the shastras tell us about this type of geometric, pointed designs, these star-shaped designs, which are a speciality of the Karnataka area. This is the interior of the Dambal temple. Now we're going to go to another area of the Deccan. We're going to go to Maharashtra. And in the 11th and 12th century, Maharashtra was ruled by these kings called the Yadavas. They were important, powerful rulers, and they built temples, of course, everybody did, but unfortunately not many of the temples they built are in very good condition, because Maharashtra suffered more than the lower part of the Deccan when it came to the Sultanate invasion. So many of their temples are damaged, and many are only survive in fragments. Probably the best one, the best of these Yadava temples from the 12th century, is at a place called Sinnar. And Sinnar is not far from Nasik, so sort of north and slightly east of Bombay. So if you're in that area, this is a temple worth visiting. What you're looking at here is a central temple with little temples at the corners of the platform. So it's 1+4. You can see one in the middle, on the left is one, and on the right is another one. And they have these towers with these central bands that go up the middle like this, and they're little towers all the way up like that. This is a Central Indian style. It has a history from the 10th, 11th century, but it came all the way down into the Maharashtra area, but not much further south. So it's an intrusion of central India into the Deccan. This gives you a better idea. You can see the intricate way in which the tower has been created. You have these central bands of little motifs, and then you have one little tower after the other going up the side like this, little bands of towers, reproducing the whole tower. So that's a sort of specialty of this Yadava style. This is the temple at a place called Jodhge, also in the Nasik area, first half of the 12th century, and this gives you some idea of the designs in close-up. Many of the carved figures are damaged in these temples. They suffered a great deal from the invasions of later times, whereas down in Karnataka and Telangana, temples were less damaged, so it's to do with the history and what happened in these areas. So let's come back to Karnataka, to the Hoystlers. Now, you all have been to Belur and Halabid and Somnathpur. You don't need me to tell you how wonderful they are. But have you been to this one, Doda Gadavahalli, which is quite near to Hassan? It's an early one, early 12th century, and it's in very good condition. And you can see it has these towers, which are all in sort of layered, pyramidal, layer cake type towers, it very precisely carved, but not decorated, quite plain, but quite impressive. And this is a temple with 4 shrines dedicated to different deities, all facing into a common mandapa. It's called the Lakshmi Devi temple because Lakshmi Devi is one of the deities, but so is Kali. And this is the Kali shrine inside the temple, and she's very powerful, and she's very much worshipped, and she's very much protected by these grotesque characters. These are the guardians of Kali at Doda Gadavahalli, and they are these larger than human size, naked, grotesque, male, terrifying guardians. Where this art and where these carvers came from, we have no idea, but just look at it. Have you ever seen anything like this before? This is something quite unusual, but there it is at Dodegardava-Halli. Another monument that some of you may not have got to, quite near to Hallibid, it's a stepwell, Hulikeri it's called. It's just, I think, 3 or 4 K from Hallibid, second half of the 12th century. And these have steps going down to the water, surrounded by little mini shrines. So each of these a tiny little sort of Hoysala shrine. So it's a very interesting temple-like water monument. And no doubt sacred bathing was part of what happened here, and then you would go to the main temple maybe to worship. But probably they were all linga shrines. It's a bit dilapidated, but again, an unusual and original design. Then we come to Belavadi, which is near Hallibid. This is another temple that is people don't go to much, the Viranarayana temple, early 13th century, so towards the end of the Hoysala period. And you can see that the mandapa has these wonderful sort of back seats where you can sit inside, and the backrests are carved with little temple models, and then there's a Nandi is placed inside there, so entrance to the temple. And this is inside, looking back to the Nandi, with these gleaming columns. And these people have always, there's a whole sort of scholarship on how were these columns created. So people used to say they were lathe-turned. They were laid out like this and rotated, and with metal wires, all these incisions were made. And then there's another group of scholars who say that can't possibly be true, they can't possibly do it like that. And people say, well, okay, how did they do it? Well, that's where they're not very good at giving an alternative explanation. So I think the rotating on a lathe, somehow they could make it like that, rotated. Maybe they were vertical and rotated them, with a swiveling base, and with metal made these very, very precise incisions and curved designs like this. You have to rotate the column to do it. So this is a typical example. You will have seen many such columns throughout the Hoysala monuments. Nice ceiling. This is in where are we now? In Belavadi, yes. These fantastic ceilings with cut-out designs, looks like tracery, look like the design is sort of floating above you, but it's all part of the stone slab. There's no metallic hinges to hold the whole thing together, and it goes up like in a dome with floating elements. Fantastic technical, design. This is a place called Mosale. Mosale is near to Hassan, and what's interesting, it has 2 temples, one to Shiva and one to Vishnu, dedicated, specifically, probably late 13th century. And it would seem that the patron wanted to have both the gods worshipped in the same style temples, and they're a matching pair of temples, so they're indistinguishable architecturally. The imagery, of course, reflects the different dedication. So you cannot argue that a Shiva temple has a different style than a Vishnu temple. This is a demonstration that both the temples are in the same style, and they are in this crisp, beautifully carved, lace-like treatment of stone. This is something I think where the Deccan area, and especially under the Hoysalas, the late Chalukyas, this is something which I think this area of India leads when it comes to this sort of lace-like treatment of stone. And of course it may be to do with the quality of the stone here. It's so finely grained, you can cut it with this sort of detail. It's a type of granite, schist almost, that takes this detail and retains the detail. It doesn't then lose it over time, as far as we can judge. Look at this. This is the parapet, dancing Shiva. Just look at the way in which all the motifs are carved. It's sort of dazzling in the detail. And there we have the Hoysala motif. You may be familiar with this, the hero, the origin of the Hoysala kings, the legendary ancestor stabbing the monster, and yelling out, and that is where Hoysala sort of supposed to come from. Anyhow, it's an indicator that the royal figure, the royal dynasty, is somehow represented on the temple with this motif. And you will see these carvings at Hallibid and Belur. Now we come to a place which has a temple of not great interest. This is a place called Agraha Bachahali. And it's not far from Mandya. It's in Mandya district. And it's not a distance to get to, but it's confusing to this because it's a hinterland. And there is this temple from the late 9th century, probably late Chalukya, which is not, you wouldn't think it's worth making a journey to see just this temple. But in front of the temple are these pillars. And as far as I know, some of you may have other knowledge, these are not found anywhere else. These are commemorative pillars to the local chiefs of this area. And when they died, these pillars were set up, their names were given, and they were represented on the top, riding elephants together with their families. It's a way, I mean, something was invented. I don't know where it came from. You know, you could say it looks like something from Rome. It doesn't look like something from the southern Deccan. But anyhow, it's something unique. I can't explain how this happened at this place, probably in the late 9th century. We don't have that information. I think we know the names of the characters who had these columns erected in their memory. And here we have at this site, Agrahara Bachahali, these wonderful series of hero stones, which you will have seen at various places throughout the Deccan. And these commemorate the valiant deaths of heroes in battle. And sometimes the lower parts of the stones have scenes of battle, showing the hero fighting. And then they show the hero being worshipped because, you know, he has died. And then at the top, the hero worshipping a linga. He has now reached the upper levels, the heavens, if you like, above. And he is now safely above the woes of the everyday world. And these hero stones also have historical information. They give us the name of the hero, maybe the battle in which they were killed. So there's a whole lot of history that can be written from these. And these, of course, published, some of you may know. So we're going to end this survey of perhaps lesser-known places to Telangana. Now, those of you who've traveled up to Hyderabad may have traveled another 150 kilometers to Warangal. Warangal was the capital of the Kakatiyas, who were the most powerful rulers at the same time as the Hoysalas and the Yadavas. So the Yadavas were in sort of Maharashtra now. The Kakatiyas were in the sort of Telangana and part of Andhra, and the Hoysalas were in Karnataka. And they, of course, fought with each other, and they were all fell victim to the invasions of the sultans at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. And Warangal suffered particularly. So what you're looking at is a ceremonial gateway to a great temple complex dedicated to Shiva, probably as a four-faced Shiva, because there are four gateways in the middle of an enormous compound. So there's a great square compound, gateway, 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 gateway. The temple is completely sort of demolished and pulled to pieces, and there are only bits of it, I'll show you in a minute. But the mystery is that the gateways were not destroyed. Now, it's very easy to push over a gateway like this. It's not been restored. It's apparently in its original. You only have to get an elephant to lean against it. That's it. But the invaders obviously thought they would keep the gateways. And then the question is, why would they keep the gateways, having taken so much trouble to destroy the temple? And the answer seems to be that they had decided they would build a mosque on the site of the temple. These things happen in history. And this was a sort of idea that we had. And then Philip Waggoner, a scholar, then did a very careful analysis and survey of the remains of the temple and realized that certain bits of the temple were being reused to create a prayer hall, and there was a mishrab, a prayer niche. They even found that. So they started to build the mosque, but they didn't get very far, as you can see from now. Other circumstances intervened, so it was a botched project. But the gateways are still there, and magnificent, I think you'll agree. They are superb examples of these toranas, and the obvious reference is wood. This reproduces in stone a wooden structure with wooden columns and wooden beams and brackets. And this is an idea that goes back to Buddhist times. If you've been to Sanchi in central India from the 1st BC, or going back to Ashoka's time, the monument is also entered through 4 Torana gateways with angled brackets. It's a long tradition in India of how you enter a sacred space. So we can only, we are sort of depressed by this sort of mess inside the temple, which is a shame. But there are little clues like this, which we find around the temple. This shows the 4-faced linga, the Chaturmukha linga, that probably was worshipped inside the temple originally, and somehow a fragment of it has escaped and is shown somewhere else. Now, if you're feeling energetic when you go to Warangal, you should be encouraged to take a further journey, another 70 kilometers to Palampet. I don't know if any of you have been to Palampet, but it's one of the most amazing temples that we have in the Deccan, and it is from the Kakatiyas, the splendid monument. Interestingly, it was not built by a king, but by a local person who had an estate in this area. And I think there was a political circumstance in which the kings were not doing too well in the capital. They were fighting battles. Meanwhile, the chief, this wealthy person who had a big status at the Kakatiya court, was able to commission a very grand monument, and he had a big estate there with great water reservoirs and fields and things, very wealthy. So this is the Ramappa temple. I believe it's recently been put on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It's the star monument of this period in this part of the Deccan. You can see it's in pretty good shape with this pinkish sandstone bottom part with the plinth and the walls, and then a painted brick tower above. The treatment of the walls is very, very meticulous with these very narrow pilasters. And look at these balconies, one on top of another, articulating the wall with deep shadows against the flat walls. So it's beautifully proportioned, and for my architectural eye, very satisfying, because such a mixture of plain and elaborate. It's beautifully, I would say, balanced. This is the entrance to the temple with this great mandapa, this great columned hall that you enter. And as you enter, you will find these bracket figures. And these are very intriguing. First of all, they're carved out of a different stone. It's a sort of polished blue-gray sort of basalt, I think it is. And just look at the proportions of these ladies. They're so elongated, their clothes are slipping off. They wear these enormous earrings and these sort of strange jewels and things. And it has been suggested that maybe they represent tribal women, local women in this remote part of the Deccan. And I think this is probably true. These don't look like courtly women, but women, and here's a huntress. So again, maybe these are women of the forest. Anyhow, they're beautifully represented. They're among the greatest masterpieces we have of Deccan figural art, comparable to what you would see at Belur and Halibid, which in Karnataka, and roughly at about the same time. 1213 is the date. So it's what was happening here in Karnataka. Something was happening like this in Telangana. The interior of the temple is splendid, in beautiful condition. Again, the columns are in this different type of stone, which takes this very, very precise detail. And the rest of it is in more this local granite. So it's beautifully preserved with, again, this meticulous treatment of the stone. We see this so often. I've showed you so many pictures of this detail. It's something you need to feast on and think about and go and look at. And I think maybe this is almost my last slide. The ceiling inside the Ramappa temple, this is Palampet, dated 1213. Again, one of these great sort of lotus designs in the middle with cut out little units, little brackets, with dancing Shiva in the corners. Little dancing Shivas in small corners, triangles, and bigger dancing Shivas in the other triangles. Again, this focus on ceilings as being an artistic place for the craftsman to work. And this is something we don't see in other parts of India in the same way at this time. If you go to Orissa, if you go to Khajuraho, you go to Gujarat, you'll get different types of ceiling designs, but these figural ones are particularly rich. All of these pictures, and a whole lot more, are reproduced in this book which you can look at and hopefully maybe purchase or order it, which I think we have really made an effort, thanks to my fellow photographer, Surendra Kumar, to capture, the beauty, the detail, and the sort of majesty of this tradition. We are not the ones to discover these temples that have never been seen before, but our aim is to showcase them, give you the basic information, direct your eye towards them, and hopefully your feet, and that you will eventually go and visit more and more of these monuments. Thank you.
George, thank you very, very much, as always, for a fantastic evening. How do you do it? I'm sure that's the first question on everyone's mind.
Well, I don't think I fit into the sort of standard academic, scholarly sort of, repertory of working with monuments. I place a great deal of emphasis on description. I think people, including myself, we need to be shown how to look at things. And if I can point out things that you haven't seen, then I'm doing a service. I'm showing you what's on the monuments and how to look at the monuments. Because the monuments tell you everything, you just have to learn how to read them. And that's where I think my architectural training helped. Whereas, so I'm not proposing theoretical ways of looking at the monuments. Let's get to know them visually. Like that, that's better, sorry. Let's get to know them visually, and then we can think about the problems of the dating, the who built them, and all these other questions. But let's look at them and learn to look. And my experience with traveling around India with travelers rather than scholars, and showing people, look, you can see this, you can see that, and people say, oh, but we didn't know, people don't know how to look. And that is the task of somebody like me. I'm trying to help you look, and if tonight you feel you've seen things you hadn't seen before, or you could appreciate things before, then I've done my job. That's what my task is.
There you go. So we can take personal questions now on the subject. Just a request to our audience, please keep your questions as brief and to the point as possible, so that as many of you get a chance to actually speak to George. Over to all of you. Yes, sir. Here, the fourth row.
Yes, come
in. Question that I just need your expertise on. Was Patadakal the place where monolithic architecture switched to the Lego type assembled temple architecture?
You're probably thinking of the whole Chalukya area, the Badami area, where we have these cave temples, these rock-cut temples. And it was a period in the late 6th century. There was rock-cut architecture, and then under some circumstance, they went to constructed buildings with separate blocks of stone built. It's one of the areas of India where we have both types of architecture, but they are in a chronology. The rock-cut is before the structural buildings, as far as we understand. But what the circumstances were that led to this transition, we don't have any historical documents. And the rock-cut tradition, of course, is earlier in the Deccan, as we have those monuments going back to 1st, 2nd century BC, in Junar and Kala and all those places.
So in a sense, it's still unclear when the Lego type of temples actually started.
We have some idea when. We don't know under what circumstance. So we can say by the late 7th century, they were beginning to construct buildings rather than cut them out. But why did they make that transition? We don't have any historical information. We can invent reasons, but we don't have. What we want, you can imagine what we would like. Here's an inscription. I, King blah blah, decided I didn't want any more rock-cut architecture. It was too difficult, too expensive, too laborious. Let's go for structural architecture. We don't have anything like that. So we would like it, but we don't have it. Yeah, so we don't know.
Very nice talk. And I enjoyed some of the photos of the sculptures. Is there any similarity between this and the ones in Khajuraho? They look quite similar.
Are you talking about ladies, or I mean, what do you have in
Some,
mind?
some of those sculptures
Oh.
look similar to what I've seen in pictures of Khajuraho.
Well, I think, I think anybody who's traveled and knows a bit about the style would never confuse them, but the same subjects. They're beautiful ladies, there are scenes of amorous things, they're the gods. The topics are the same, the material is different, and the style of the carving is different. And this is what people like myself try to crystallize. So you can tell the difference. So suddenly a piece of sculpture turns up on its own. You can say, right, this is a Khajuraho 11th century, North India. This is Orissa, it's Eastern India. No, it's Gujarat. So the style, the material is a way of distinguishing. Then you have the unifying themes, which are the subjects of the. So I would say there's no Khajuraho Deccan direct connection that I could point you towards. So it's you remembering what you've seen at Khajuraho, enjoying what you've seen at Khajuraho, and then remembering when you look at this material, I think.
Hi. So, based on your study or experience, what sort of tools they might have used? Question one. Second thing is what they're trying to convey in this type of temples, the culture, or for the those days for that population or for the future.
Oh, well, I said the first question is, we know they used iron tools, probably quite rudimentary, but the skills of the craftsmen were such they could execute exquisitely detailed monuments. The purpose of these temples is what you're asking. And this is a big question. And I don't have a big answer for you, but people always say, well, they were so pious, the kings were so religious, therefore they built all these temples as an expression of their personal religious beliefs. That's one way of thinking. The other is, no, they built these temples to show their might, their power. They wanted to sort of have visual expression of their influence on the kingdom. That's another way of thinking. Both are probably true in part, you see. So there are many reasons why people built temples. And one way of using architecture is to express your sense of power and control. And as you know, this goes on today. You only have to look at the buildings here in Bangalore, to understand that this is nothing new. This is what happened in the past too. They probably did it in their palaces and their forts, but from this period, we don't have any palaces and forts. They probably were built in timber, but they must have been very impressive too, I guess.
Thank you. That was really, really wonderful. I didn't realize we had so many treasures here in Karnataka. My question to you was, I noticed in your photographs, there were no boundary walls or anything protecting these temples or anything like that. They seem to be like a part of regular village life and for usage, on a daily basis. So is that going to sort of destroy it in some way? Or, don't we need to protect them?
Well, most of the monuments I showed you are protected. They are under the State Archaeological Service or the central government service. And some of these temples are in compounds with compound walls and gateways. They are separated from the urban development around them, or they were. But of course, when I began working at Aiholi so many years ago, people had built their mud houses right up to the temples, and they were living in the temples, and that is why the famous Lad Khan temple in Aiholi, some of you may have seen, was named because there was a Mr. Lad Khan living in it when the British first went there. And this was, they didn't know how else to call it, so they called it, and it's still called today, the Lad Khan temple. So there was this impingement of village life, or town life, if you like, because these were nice stone structures with wonderful roofs. They were wonderful. They could be used as habitations when they were no longer functioning as religious places because the sponsorship had gone, because these places then became little villages. The kings were no longer there. There was enough patronage to maintain all these worship, all these cults in a place like Aiholi. So these temples were dilapidated and abandoned. And now, of course, there's the whole process of bringing some of these temples back into worship. But at the early Chalukya sites, I think almost none of them were in worship 50 years ago.
Hi, thank you so much for that amazing talk. I had a question regarding the temple that you mentioned was commissioned by Someshwara too, in memory of his father. And then you showed us a small picture where you speculate quite likely it is the depiction of the king and with the how do how do you reach such a conclusion?
Right.
Anything on it?
So why is it that this carving has been identified as a royal portrait? I'm not the first person to do it. I think because we have this story, so we know there's the story of a king building a temple in memory of his father. There is a carving that does not show a god. It's definitely not an image of Shiva or Vishnu. It's two-armed. It has all the attributes of a human figure in the sense it's two-armed. He's seated in this special way, with one leg like this, which is known always to be a sort of a courtly way of depicting. We have it in Buddhist art. So there are several ways of leading us to this interpretation, but it doesn't have on the carving, this is a portrait of Someshwara I, which is what you would like, and we would all like, but I think it's something we can accept with a cautionary note. Remember, we're not dealing with black and white facts here. We're dealing with interpretations. But if it's true, it's very important because we don't have a lot of carvings that we think could depict a royal figure. So this is something for us to consider. So I think there are several other such figures in this late Chalukya art, which I can't remember now, but on some beams and things, which apparently are also supposed to be royal portraits.
Hello, George. Sharda here.
Oh, hi,
Lovely
Sharda.
to hear you. So, it was a wonderful talk. So, George, coming to the soapstone and the carving, with that finesse, of course, that's a very soft stone. So when it's freshly quarried, it takes a lot of detail. But, I was at this conference, Indian Ocean Conference, earlier this year in York, where there was some examples given of the soapstone carving from Africa. And it's interesting how there was so much of evidence actually found in the quarries of them trying to work and experiment. Of course, they were just making these kinds of vessels using some lathe turning, much more basic. And here you find these extraordinary temples with complete pillars and all that. And there's no evidence of them having worked them and things like that in the way that you might expect, because it's quite difficult, to achieve such perfection without some practice and such like. So what do you think might have been the reason? Were they just reusing all the old, breaking things down to rubble and using it for foundations or whatever? Or, what could be possibly an explanation that we don't see the experimental stages of something so complicated?
Are you asking me what led to this experimental aspect of the architecture to invent new forms using new techniques?
Well, and also why we don't find any of the stages of that experimentation, which, you see this finished material. So would they have been just...
You mean it would be nice to find an unfinished temple with a half-finished column, which would give us a clue as how it was actually done. Where is Shiv?
There might have been some mistakes. So where did...
Yes. I think there are plenty of mistakes, yes. But people haven't examined... Where is Dr. Shiv Kumar? Where are you? Sri Kumar, yeah. This is the man to give you some information, because he's worked on the quarries and the technical aspects of carving. Sri Kumar, why don't you give us a comment here?
Thank you, John. Yeah, we do have unfinished aspects, and there are some partially turned columns also in some of the, I can't remember which ones now, but in some of the Hoysala temples lying around. So we do have some clues from the working that I do believe that they might have been lathe turned.
Are you a lathe turned person? Are you?
Yes, very much.
and also, you are the one who also drew our attention to the quarries where they source the stones.
Yeah,
which I think is really
Patadakal
important.
and many other places too.
Yes.
And we have the wedge marks and all that, how they used to extract the stone and then process it. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Okay, thank you so much for the talk. I just have one question. At Agrahara Bachalli, I've seen these hero stones. There's a very huge number of women warriors. Is there some information on that? And my second question is, in Belwadi, or the main deity is way bigger than the doorway of the sanctum sanctorium. Is there a way like the stone was put in and then, how was it done? So was the stone there and then they carved it with just going into the small area of sanctum sanctorium? So yeah.
I didn't quite understand. Are you asking how these images were put into the sanctuary through the
sanctum.
doorways?
In the doorway. The doorways are really small.
It's because they're too large to get through. So as if they were finished or placed there before the sanctuary was finished.
Right.
I think it's a possibility, and we have also these nandis in some of the temples that don't fit in through the doorways. How did they get there? What is the... Yeah. Built around them or placed there, yes. So I don't know exactly. They're sort of mysterious, confusing details.
Hi, George. A wonderful talk, as usual. I was quite curious about the Kakatiya, the basalt sculptures. So where did they get the material from? Because the rest of the stone is different. And I am talking in
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
So the rest of the stone is different, what they built the building.
where's this
But
special
where did
greenish
they get
stone?
the black, green
I
stone.
don't know, but I think people do know, but I'm not the person who does. It must be some local. Some of these dolerite or these special types of granites or basalts, we have them at the Hazarama temple in Hampi, the 4 columns, you all know that. They are found rarely in granite. They're special. You have to look for them. And they were prized, these types of stones. And they were used for very special parts of the temple, like the one at Palampet, for the bracket figures and the columns inside. But I don't know which quarry they came from. But other people have studied that more than I have. So no positive answer. But I'm sure it's local. I don't think they were carried these stones more than, short distances.
I had a question around the stepwells. Could you talk a little bit more about the stepwells? For example, just round the corner, there's a Chola temple there in Halasuru. I think when they were constructing a building, they found a Kalyani or a temple. So maybe if you can tell, and again, like parallels with like Sibidar has the courage system for water management. So can you talk a little bit about the water management aspect? What was the purpose of the stepwell, and maybe because you find a lot of stepwells up north and on the west, but not so much in the south. But there are still temples like the Bhogidandishwarya temple also has a stepwell. So one, obviously the purpose was to do the ritual bathing, but did they have any other purpose in terms of water management? Have you seen those systems? Do you think those stepwells exist maybe in some of these temples but have not been excavated?
I think it's still a relatively new topic for studies, but we know in Western India, places like Gujarat, where these stepwells are very common, they have a range of uses from everyday water collecting for a community to ritual stepwells, which have images of gods. They become sort of water temples, if you like. The water is sacred. So there's a crossover between practicality and water management for a community, and also the worship of water and worship of water deities. Vishnu sleeping on the waters, for example, we find in Patan, I think, in Gujarat. So in the Deccan, we're just beginning to realize that there's a whole set of stepwells here. We haven't really, there's no proper publication of the stepwells of the Deccan, because we've always thought it was Rajasthan and Gujarat, those dry, arid areas. But Lakundi has one. I showed you the one at Sudi. You mentioned one here, is in the Bangalore area. I think we are going to find more and more. And of course, there's a famous stepwell at Hampi that maybe some of you have seen, which is a late Chalukya stepwell that was brought there and re-erected there under some circumstance we don't know. So I think I'm not the person to do water management studies, but I think people are beginning to see these stepwells within a greater landscape and environmental situation.
Thank you for this wonderful talk, Doctor. I had a question. I was curious about the first set of temples you discussed, the ones in Alampur, the ones that resembled Kalachuri temples, because we see evidences of that in the Umaria district in near about Jabalpur as well.
Oh, okay.
So I was wondering if this was a standalone incident. Like, do we get other examples of Kalachuri temples around the around the area around Deccan, or was it a very specific, was a product of a specific alliance? And
Well,
yeah.
I suspect, we haven't studied this very much, but this sudden appearance of this alien style from another part of India at Patadakkal, with this historical circumstance that we know about a Chalukya prince having an alliance, marrying these two girls, bringing them back to the Chalukya heartland, and they eventually become, when he becomes king, they become queens. So this is a particular historical circumstance that is a possible explanation. But I don't think we find these Central Indian temple towers, temple styles, until much later. So from the late 7th, early 8th century, this is a possible, we still have question marks here. But what do you think? Does it make sense that a princess, people could bring temple styles with them? Ah, right. Only this inscription, which says that this prince built it in honor of his mother, who was one of these princesses, you see? So by the time these two girls, let's say they're teenagers, they're brought as girls to a teenage prince, these sort of situations. 20, 30 years pass, they are queens of an extremely powerful ruler, I think Vikramaditya II. He has this big victory with the Pallavas in the 740s. He comes back to Patadakkal, and his two queens build these two memorial temples, which are the Virupaksha and Mallikarjuna temples at Patadakkal, the great two pair of temples built by the two sisters. And they are not in a northern Indian style. They are, by this time, in a southern Indian, a typical advanced southern Indian style. So it's as if they have integrated their architectural identity, if you like, into that of the Deccan. So these are all speculations, right? So these are just thoughts on possible, and that's what we enjoy doing. And when you visit these places, you must enjoy doing it too. It's part of involving yourself with the stories of these monuments.
To untrained eyes, when we visit temples, we usually go to worship the deity and take the blessings. And then, the beauty of these historic temples is very overwhelming. So, to an untrained eye, what would you suggest as a guide? Like, where do we start when we start admiring the beauty and the architecture of these historic temples? How do we go about it?
How do you train your eye?
Yeah.
Well, look. It is emotive, and I think that the experience of going to worship, maybe with family members, this whole experience obliterates sometimes the aesthetic aspect of looking at the building. So I had Indian architecture students working with us at Hampi, and we discovered that they had no idea really how a temple worked architecturally, even though they were architecture students. I said, but you must know about it, you go all the time. And they said, no, we just go with our families, and we do this and we leave, we don't look. So in a way, once you've finished your salutations to the deity, made your wishes, stop for a moment, take a breath, be quiet, and just walk around and look. You see, I think it's quite difficult when you're transacting with the deity as part of puja, you're doing darshan, it's quite hard to be thinking about these things. You're in another space. But it is worth taking time. It takes time, and it takes repeated looking. So, there's no formula. You can train yourself with photographs, so you know that when you go there, you must look out for this, because it's there, and then you seek it out. In the photographs, we notice at the back there is something. Nobody will tell you at the temple, but if you make the trip, you'll find it maybe. So, good luck.
Hi, I had a question regarding the mythology surrounding the temples. So maybe Chaturbhuji, like you showed us one picture where it was like a Chaturbhuj Shiva. So I have visited like quite a few temples, but I have not seen Chaturbhuji Shiva somewhere. So is there any record, or like are you maybe interested into something mythology?
I'm not, but there are quite a few temples with sanctuaries with 4 doorways. And each doorway looks into the center, and in the center is a linga with a face of Shiva looking out through the doorway. And at Warangal, we have this configuration of a temple in the middle of a city which is the capital of a kingdom. And out in 4 directions, the power of the god radiates out in the north, south, east, and west, through the doorways of the temple, through the gateways that I showed you, and through the gateways of the fort. So these 4-faced images of Shiva sometimes have a, what would you call, a sort of cosmic political sort of source. And Warangal is a cosmic city, a great circular city with doorways, gates on 4 directions, and they lead into the temple, and there is the 4-faced linga. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable things we have. But it's not by any means the only 4-faced linga. We have quite a few of these in temples throughout India, and often they go with shrines which have 4 doorways, so that the power of the god, if you like, radiates outwards. So it's a special type of cult of Shiva. So this is by no means unique, but they are worth looking for.
Hello. Thank you for sharing that amazing knowledge that you shared today. I had a question. I mean, you already answered that there was some form of migration of knowledge from various parts of India to the Deccan as well. But I wanted to understand, was there any migration of the artisans or conversation between artisans in the Deccan, amongst the different places that you shared today? Was there any migration or conversation happening amongst them, because you have an Aihole and then you have a Pattadakal and then you have something in Varappal? Is there any conversations happening there as well?
We only have the architectural consequences. We don't have any history which tells us this group of artisans, architects, builders, whatever you like, came from here and they went there. For the Hoysalers we have information, but not for the Chalukyas. But we have the evidence. And there's one temple at Pattadakal called the Papanata, you may have seen. It's away from the main group, in which southern Indian and northern Indian elements are combined. So suddenly we think, here the 2 different groups of workmen have been brought together under some circumstance, and they said, you do the parapet, I'll do the niches, you do the basement, and they somehow work together. It's what we would call a hybrid monument, stylistic synthesis. So this also happens, but we only have the architectural evidence. We don't have the sociological, if you like, evidence of these people, who these people were, or where they came from. My goodness.
Hi, George. This is Manohar here.
Yeah.
Really inspired by the talk. I will definitely visit most of the temples, if not all.
It'll keep you busy, yes.
Thank you. I was wondering, and I'll probably be putting you on the spot, but do you have like a favorite temple or temple complex among everything that you have shown and visited?
Yeah. It's not a question I can answer truthfully, but, I began when I was, 26, which is a hell of a long time ago, with the Chalukya monuments, the Badami group. And they have always had a special place in my heart because they are so beautiful, the place is so extraordinary, and it was such a remote place when I worked there in the early 70s. It was like the end of the world, with these beautiful temples with sculptures, and nobody knew anything about the carvings because there are hardly any carvings from the Chalukya temples in museums. You have to go to these places to see this art, and you can only wonder at the variety of it. So it's an unsatisfactory answer. Yes.
Hi again. Thanks for all your work at Hampi. My question is more around restoration of temples that the government undertakes. You may or may not be able to answer this truthfully. How do you feel when active places of worship need restoration, but they also go overboard and do stuff like the white paint that you've seen in some places? The place which affected me personally is the Kodanda Ramaswamy temple at Hampi behind the Yantradharaka temple, very close to the Yantradharaka temple. It got a facelift. The thing which looked very old and very austere has turned very modern, right out of the blue. And it happened like over a summer. And that changes a lot of things. It changes what the temple used to be versus what it was.
Well, it's a big problem. What to do and how to do it, and what is the rationale. And one of the problems is that this is not a discourse. People do not sit and say, right, we have this problem. This temple is in bad condition. What should we do? You think we should do this. You think we should do that. Let's discuss what should be done and why you think this is better than that. This sort of conversation doesn't exist here. People just go in and do it. They know They think they know, and we are not always pleased with the results. So I think some of the work is acceptable, some is doubtful, and some is unacceptable. So, it's a mix. And there's no standard way of regulating this. And among the worst, or let's say most the severest practitioners are the people in charge of the temples themselves, not the archaeologists, but they are people concerned with worship and ritual. So they whitewash, they get rid of the ceiling paintings because they're looking dilapidated, put whitewash and do new ones, which is probably what happened at Virupaksha temple at Hampi some time back. So they are not concerned about the history and the story of the monument. They want the present day workings of the monument. It's the conflict. It's not only in India, of course. It's a global problem, but in other countries they have reached a more perhaps sophisticated way of deciding what to do. So I just hope that here in this country we will work towards better ways of managing the past.
Namaste. I'm comfortable in Kannada. I have two questions. One, ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಭಾರತದ ಥರ ಉತ್ತರ ಭಾರತದಲ್ಲೂ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಗೋಪುರಗಳು ಇರ್ತಿತ್ತ ಒಂದು. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು
What is the question?
The first one, yes.
ಎರಡನೇದು, ನಮ್ಮ ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುವಂತಹ ವೇಸರ ಮತ್ತು ದ್ರಾವಿಡ ಶೈಲಿ, ಇವನ್ ನಾವು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಕೂಟರು ಮತ್ತು ಪಲ್ಲವರು ನಮ್ಮ ಬೇರೆ ಕಡೆ ಹೋದ್ರೂ ಸಹ ಯಾಕೆ ಮಿಶ್ರಣ ಆಗಲಿಲ್ಲ? ಮತ್ತು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗೆ ಒಂದು ಲೈನ್ ಇದೆಯಾ ಏನಾದರೂ, ಲೈಕ್ ನಾಗರ ಮತ್ತು ನಮ್ಮ ಈ ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಭಾರತ ಡಿವೈಡ್ ಆಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಏನೋ ಲೈನ್ ಇದೆಯಾ? ಮಿಶ್ರಣ ಯಾಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗಲಿಲ್ಲ?
Why was there no continuity between... Am I right? You're saying why was there no continuity from the Rashtrakutas to other parts in terms of stylistic developments?
I think there was transitions, and you get early Chalukyas, Nolambas, late Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, which I didn't mention. They're also important here. There are elements that are carried over from one style to the next, and other things which are discarded, and other things which are invented. So it's always a creative relationship to what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen. So this is the study of style. You can say, this is something which comes back. We are repeating it, but now we're doing something different. We're making something creative and we're developing. So all these different things are happening. It's very complicated. And I'm only touching on some of these historical moments in the development of style. But people who have studied all of Indian temple architecture, including a very famous scholar called Professor Deccan, who edited these encyclopedias of Indian, he said the most creative phase for him in all of the temple architecture of India that he studied was these late Chalukyas. He said they were extremely experimental, and no two temples are quite alike. They're always playing with manipulating and inventing new things. So some moments are very creative, and other moments are very, what would you call, conservative. They're always repeating. They don't do anything new. But the Deccan area, especially what I've shown you today, I think is full of this creativeness, this inventiveness, which I think makes it so fascinating. I hope I have answered some of your questions.
And what the first part of your question was about the South Indian gopuras.
These gopuras, like you get at Hampi, this is a Tamil thing. It was invented by the Cholas, and then the Vijayanagara kings took up this gopura. They took old temples and built a huge gopura in front. It was theirs. It was a way of saying it's ours, even though it wasn't theirs. But it was a quick way of doing it. And remember, they were built with brick. The towers are brick, and they're hollow. They're not stone like the early ones. So this became the Vijayanagara imperial style of the 16th and 17th centuries.
Hi, George. So thank you for the talk. So I have a question. So thinking about the Chola dynasty and the Brihadeshwara temple, it has some knowledge on the international trade that they did back then, and also some elements which said about how they did their businesses and so on. So it kind of speaks about what they did then as well. But when you compare that to the other temples that you showed today, there are stories of mythological stories, except for a few of what you mentioned on the tribal women, etc. So I'm asking if you think that there is certain temples which spoke about what the people did then other than the mythological stories? Thank you.
Are you asking me if the inscriptions, the writing on the temples, gives us a portrait of social life, political life, economic life?
Right, on both the inscription and the sculptures, if there is a possibility.
Well, people, of course, do this sort of interpretation of the carvings. They look at the carvings and try to make deductions about social life, social levels. I always say that if you go to Pachatakkal and you want to know what the court, the Chalukya court, was like, how were people dressed, you just have to look at the sculptures, all the jewelry, the hairstyles, the costumes. But we don't have a lot of, I would say, social, political material. The Cholas were very good at this sort of thing. They took a lot of time making claims about conquest and economic things. The temples we have are mostly about grants. You know, I, blah, blah, gave so much on the occasion of Bungbing, that sort of thing. You know, personal grants inscribed on the temple so that you are permanently recorded as having been generous. So, and I'm not the best person to ask because I'm not really a specialist on epigraphy, though all the inscriptions on these monuments, as far as I know, have been translated into English and are available. You know, they can be, you can source all this material and see if you can extract from them the sort of answers that you're asking.
George, thank you very much from all of us, of course, for another fabulous, fabulous evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all being here, but I would like some of you to applaud the photographer, whose image is... Sorry, stand up here. Where is he?
Surendra Kumar was here
Where
just
is
a
he?
moment ago and he's vanished.
Because I think
He was right here.
we have been served extremely well by the imagery. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for being a fantastic audience as always.